It's easy to forget and to trivialize the significance of Jesus not beginning his public ministry till he was 30 and Jesus being a tradesman. And his parables are not the parables of an academic, they're not the parables of an intellectual, they're a parable of somebody who lived among common people. He didn't vest his future in the elite professional class.
I'm thankful that Bob Yarbrough is my friend because he is a man of multiple talents. He's a logger, he is a runner, he's possibly the hardest working person I know. He can sit in a chair and write 3,000 words, that's almost an entire chapter of a book, in one day when he's focused and ready to go. He's a theologian and he really understands what it means to work in a variety of settings. From the Center for Faith and Work here in St. Louis, this is Working with me, your host, Dan Doriani. Here we strive to fire the imagination of Christians who long to practice their faith in the workplace. Through conversations with doctors, athletes, teachers, executives, and more, we seek to engage those who desire to do significant work, to practice love and justice in their work, and who dare to change their corner of the world through that work. My guest today is Bob Yarbrough, who's been a friend of mine for a number of years, and I wanted to have you on our program today, Bob, because you are one of those people who has worked in the field of manual labor, skilled manual labor, and academic work. So you've done research on things like the work ethic of the Apostle Paul, but you've also worked. So just a little bit of background. Bob is a New Testament scholar, teaches at Covenant Seminary, also was at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and Wheaton, now University. He was also a pastor for a number of years, and he was also, gets called different things in different places, but we could say in Montana you were a logger for a number of years.
Or timber feller.
Or timber feller, and also have done a lot of tree work, and that's very intense manual labor. You have to be strong, you have to climb trees, carry around heavy saws, but it's also very mental labor. It takes a lot of mental skill. So I wanted you to address that. Before we get to it, I want to make sure our guests know that Bob has also written a number of books, well-regarded, well-reviewed. He's spoken in every inhabited continent except South America. We'll try to get him there sometime, and maybe a dozen countries, maybe more. So he is an estimable person, author, educator, manual laborer, mental manual laborer. Can you tell us a little bit about your work as a tree feller or logger, and why manual labor is dignified and challenging both mentally and physically? Tell us a few things about what you did.
Well, you're using the term logger, and that works. That's kind of a generic term for everything that goes into moving a tree from a mountain forest, typically in Montana or Idaho where I worked, to a sawmill. I got into this through climbing trees. My father and grandfather worked for Davey Tree Expert Company based in Kent, Ohio. So it was that skill set of using a chainsaw and doing things with trees that eventually, when I landed in Montana and was desperate for money, I scraped together the last of our money, my wife and I, and bought a saw and went to work in the woods. So it is demanding physically. It's also demanding mentally because you have to stay alive. And there's an art to getting big trees down without hurting yourself, and getting them down without hanging the trees up in other trees, and getting them down without destroying the timber you're supposed to be preserving. And there are lots of ways to mess up a strip that you're sawing. If you talk about climbing trees, obviously you've got the height factor, and it's easy to fall out. It's easy to do property damage. Often you're taking down a tree because it's over somebody's swimming pool or over their house, or it's next to power lines. All kinds of ways to go wrong. But that's the challenge.
Give us a sense of the size. So trees, you can climb trees that are 30, 60, 80, 100 feet, and they can weigh many tons?
Well, certainly many tons. The biggest tree I cut was a ponderosa pine that made 7,000 board feet. The bottom log was 60 inches across, and at the small end, it was still 45 inches across. So when they sent that log to the mill, they put two smaller logs on a long log truck, which holds 40-foot logs, and then they put that log on top of it. It was a 3-log load, and that weighed over 40,000 pounds, those 3 logs. So yeah, a big log can weigh 4 tons, 5 tons, 6 tons.
Yeah.
And a tree, obviously, much more.
Right. Can you tell us about a time when you needed to get it right, or else maybe a house was on the line, or maybe your own life was possibly imperiled?
Well, Dan, you may remember a big tree I took down for your daughter and son-in-law.
I do remember it.
And that was right in between some houses. And happily, there was a yard that things would kind of drop down into. But you had to be able to drop everything down into that yard. And that was a sweet gum tree that was right at 100 feet tall. And where I tied in was about 85 feet off the ground. So everything had to be either jumped, we call it a jump cut. When you kind of jump a big limb, you either had to get it to go right down in that spot, or you had to tie ropes on it and swing it around.
And even the side branches were massive.
They were. They look small when you're standing on the ground. You say, well, that's not that big of a limb, and then it gets to the ground and you realize, oh, that's 20 inches through.
Right.
I first went up that tree with a saw with a 16-inch bar. And of course, I don't do this every day anymore. This is what, 5 or 6 years ago?
It was 5 years ago.
Yeah, 5 years ago. But I got up there and I realized there are no cuts up here that this saw will make. All these limbs are bigger than 16 inches. So I went down and I got my saw with a 24-inch bar. And that's the one that I used to take down the rest of well, when we got to the trunk of the tree, I had to pull up my big saw, which has a 28-inch bar.
I like that. I wasn't using my 24-inch blade, if I can use it in layman's terms. I had to get my big one.
Right. Well, it's a matter of engine displacement. The one with the 24-inch, that's just over 3 cubic inch saw. But the big one is a Husqvarna 394 XP, so it's close to 100 cc's.
Oh yeah.
So it's very, very powerful.
Yeah. So a lot of people have the idea that physical labor, tree work, for example, or carpentry, is antithetical to mental labor. So there's professionals and there's laborers. And, there's a book written not all that long ago called Shop Class as Soul Craft that was, at the top of a New York Times bestseller list. And his thesis was, no, actually manual labor, skilled manual labor, is intensely creative, thoughtful, mentally skilled, it's not just manual labor. My sense is you would agree with that thesis and maybe have a few things to say about it.
Well, probably on any job there are the menial aspects. So like if you're building fence, just digging the hole itself, there might be aspects of that that's just hard work. But to keep our vision on trees here, dragging brush to the brush chipper in itself is just, back-breaking, arduous work. But when you look at the big picture, how a job gets done, if you have, say, 7 people on the job, how do you use all those people well and nobody's standing around not doing anything? How do you do it safely? How do you manage the risks that are involved in this particular job, especially when a lot of these jobs, if we talk about the say tree removal in a residential area, you're pushing the limits of what the physics will allow, because the trees may be so big and they may be leaning over a house. Ropes will only hold so much. Every situation has its limitations as to what you can do. So
I'm guessing they're never identical, or almost never.
Of course, they're never identical. And somebody has to be in charge of all that. And sometimes there are 2 or 3 people that really, really need to be sharp at what they do. I was always a climber. And when I climbed, I was young and I was inexperienced. And I learned very quickly there were guys on the ground that, they looked pretty inept and they were not climbers. But a good ground man was absolutely essential on huge, we call them takedowns, because he had the experience. And he knew exactly, when to hold a rope, when to let a rope go, how many wraps to take around a tree to snub the rope when big pieces would start to come down, how many people needed to be on a rope. And climbers, they know a lot, and they basically are responsible. They're kind of like the pilot. They're responsible for things. But every climber knows that the ground man has veto power over what you rig up. And often he'll tell you as you're going, that's not going to work, or why don't you try this or that. Nobody wants to destroy a house. Nobody wants to die. Nobody wants to hurt somebody else. Nobody wants to make a lost time type mistake or property damage mistake. But that will happen unless you do everything pretty much exactly right when you get to a certain level of risk. So that's very challenging mental. Plus, often there is some there's a physical intermixing. You've got your timing, how fast you cut something off, how much you let it swing before you finally cut it off. Even physically holding yourself in position. Sometimes you've got a saw up above your head, and you're cutting between where your safety rope is and where the rope is tied around that piece. So you've got maybe a 12 or 16 inch zone, and you've got to make a flush cut, or else you'll cut through one of those ropes.
And then you're in trouble, to say the least.
You're tied to all this. Mm-hmm. And you're 60 feet off the ground, and you've been doing this for 3 or 4 hours, and you're dehydrated, you're exhausted. It's 95 degrees in St. Louis, and you've quit sweating. And this is the third or fourth cut like this you've made in a row, and as you go down the tree, the cuts get bigger. Mm-hmm. So, physically, emotionally, intellectually, there's a lot that goes into these seemingly, sort of menial physical labor jobs.
Now, you and I, we're both professors. I think you and I would both agree that being a professor can be pretty menial. Also, writing an exam and proofing it, making sure the points add up. Making sure that the program that we use to grade maybe some aspect of the exam works. It's, we can listen to music on the headphones while doing this. This is not grindingly demanding work. Every job has its menial aspects.
For sure. Yeah. And you didn't mention, I think, grading, but that's often very menial. That's why we have teaching assistants.
It can be pretty routine. There's no question about that. Yeah, so everybody has their menial work. It's also true that in every job, people are interested in quitting sometimes. So I'm just going to do a little background. You're an author, I'm an author. People sometimes ask the question, how do you write a book? Well, the answer is one sentence, one paragraph at a time. You write enough paragraphs eventually of a book. And of course, the content has to be good. Logging is, sort of one branch at a time until it's all done. There are a lot of things like that. You're also a long distance runner. You've done sprinting and long distance both. And in sports, there's often this same interest in starting but not finishing, I'll say. So people have walked off the job in just about every field, including logging. Why do people quit? And how important is endurance in our work?
Well, if you quit, then you're out of work. So certainly endurance is important in all of our work. But I think people quit sometimes because of a lack of a sense of purpose. They don't know why they're there for sure, and maybe they thought, they typically people hire on for a job because they need money, and they may think, what I'm getting for this is not worth the money, and
it's too dangerous, maybe,
too dangerous, too cold, or too hot, too hard, too uncomfortable. Sometimes they don't get along with the people that they're hired on with. If you switch over to athletics, sometimes people realize they're in over their head. They're in a competition where they're going to get beat, and the longer they stay in that race, the worse the beating is going to be. I remember, and I don't remember if it was 64 or 68, but I remember Jim Ryan dropping out of an Olympic time trial. And of course, he had run, I think, a 351 mile in high school. And when I was in high school, everybody's hero was Jim Ryan. But I think he got maybe kind of clipped and like half spiked or something. And for some reason, he dropped out of the race. And that was just inconceivable to me that somebody would do that. But I think it shows that no matter what level you're at, there's a temptation to throw in the towel because things seem like what you're being asked to do, it's not worth what you're getting to do it. Or I would put it, you just don't have it in you anymore, to face the demands. Or running, a lot of times it's pain.
Yes.
Just the pain of pushing yourself beyond what you want to do. And I'm trying to think of why people quit in logging or tree work, and it varies with the individuals.
Right. So I've been thinking about quitting off and on lately since, for one thing, I was reading a little bit about a musical group who just gave up on an album. They worked on it for 3 years, and they said it's never going to be what we want. We just throw it aside, and maybe 10 years later we'll come back to it, and some shell of what we intended will be available to the public. Before we started, I was somehow also thinking about Olympics, and a man named Jason Lezak, who's known only a little, mostly known as Michael Phelps' teammate. You might remember about 12 years ago, Phelps won 8 gold medals, and first time ever to win 8 gold medals in an Olympic game. And Lezak was the key player in that 8th and final event that the American relay team was not supposed to win. Phelps was swimming in his weakest distance, the freestyle 100 meter, and Lezak was the anchor. And the French were supposed to win. They had the best times. They had the fastest swimmer in the world. Everybody expected the French to win. And Lezak entered the pool with a half body length deficit, which is pretty much insuperable at that level, especially when you're up against the best swimmer in the world, and Lezak was maybe the 5th best in the world or 3rd best at the time. And we all know the image of Phelps, kind of screaming, "Come on, finish," and the crowd's going berserk, and they touch apparently simultaneously, and not to give it away, but Lezak won by 100th of a second, beating the fastest swimmer in the world. But what intrigued me was interviews afterward in which Lezak said at the 50-meter mark, halfway through his leg, he was thinking about quitting because it was pointless. He said, there's no way I'm going to catch this man, so why bother? Just cruise into a silver. And then he says he was thinking this as he's swimming, but hey, you're at the Olympics, why not give it your best shot? And he relaxed a little bit and started to gain on Alain Bernard, that was his foe. And Bernard saw him gaining on him and tightened up a little bit, and then started watching him and started drifting over to Lezak's lane, which then allowed Lezak to kind of breeze off him. If you were cycling, be breezing in the water. You kind of get pulled along a little bit, and then he gained more, and Lezak kept swimming in a relaxed way, and Bernard tightens up more, and he won by 100th of a second. And I just found it amazing. Oh, and they won. Not only did they win the gold medal, but they broke the world's record by 4 seconds, and Lezak swam the fastest 100 meters of all time. And in the middle of it, he was thinking about quitting, and he thought, why not keep going? Why not keep fighting? And there's something about people that makes them want to quit. There's also something that makes them say, no, I'm not going to quit. And it seems to me that you, as an author and a long-distance runner and a skilled manual labor guy, know maybe more about that than anybody I know.
Well, certainly diligence is more important than brilliance. Mm. And there are a lot of academicians. A lot of us are not that smart in this or that even domain of what we do. Some people go pretty far, say, in New Testament studies, but they may not be great at languages, ironically. Mm-hmm. And I saw it in my doctoral work for the first time, really, how important it was just to show up and put in the hours. And sometimes brilliant people, they don't finish. You mentioned writing several times. Writing is one of the hardest things I think that there is to do because the goal out there is so far away. And if you're writing, say, a commentary, I remember writing on Romans. There are 432 verses, and in that format, I had 200 words per verse.
Which is not much.
It's not much.
It's got to be condensed.
But let's just say you're going to try to do 5 to 7 verses a day. Still, you get done with one, and now there's another one staring at you. Okay, you use your creative energies and your understanding to get that one, and then there's another one, and maybe it's more gnarly than the last one. And after you've done this like 100 or 200 times, even though it's scintillating material, we're human, and it just feels like it's never going to get finished. And that's a best case scenario. Not everything is interesting to write about as Romans.
Right.
And sometimes you're not writing 200 words, you're writing more like 1,000 words. On my Pastoral Epistles commentary, it was more of 1,000 words per verse. Well, you've got to cast about, and you've got to do a lot of thinking, a lot of reading, and a lot of formulating. And again, I think there's only 240 verses or so in the Pastoral Epistles. 1 Timothy has 113. I do remember that because I taught it last week. But that's still a lot of time. A 1,000-word essay on 242 different verses, or whatever it is. That takes a lot of persistence. So not quitting is the key, definitely.
So I've written on Matthew a couple times actually, and that's about 1,000 verses. And I would divide it up. Like I'm at the 10% mark. I'm at the 1/8 mark. That's only 12.5. I'd constantly create little goals for myself to keep it going. And the day I hit 51%, it was, just ecstasy. We're on the downhill. But, these projects can take years.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So we agree that endurance is really important. You've done some work on the Apostle Paul and his work ethic, and you've done extensive work. Could you say a few words about what you learned from the Apostle Paul?
Paul was physically tough. I don't think people give him credit for having traveled right at 15,000 miles by foot and by little boat. And then if you read 2 Corinthians 11, you're reminded of all the beatings that he took, all the various dangers and deprivations that he was exposed to. Fairly early on in Acts 14, he's stoned,
right,
and left for dead. They dragged him out of town, they stoned him, and he either died or they thought he was dead, and he came back and went right back to what he was doing. So I learned that there's a real resilience to Paul as a minister. I also realized that he set the bar very high for his expectations for his output. So words like toil are very common. And where I really zeroed in on this was doing 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, and seeing how heavily he leaned on these men, not because they were something special or superhuman, because that's intrinsic to being a disciple. And of course, we have disciples in all kinds of capacities. But I think if we say the analogy of parenting is a 24/7 type enterprise if you do it well, and especially at certain zones of children's lives, somebody has to be working.
And it lasts 20 years, more or
less. It goes on and on and on.
Right.
And it's the same way in ministry. And a lot of ministers, I think, succumb to indolence. They think that this is kind of an easy job, and they treat it that way, and little by little it becomes much easier than it should be.
Right.
Whereas there are a lot of ways that we can be physically involved in our work. We can be busy without becoming workaholics or just sort of obsessed with staying busy.
Yeah.
But being engaged is hard work at all levels, and you certainly see that in Paul.
So just for those who would like an analogy, 15,000 miles walked is like walking essentially from New York to San Diego, and then back, and then to San Diego again, and then back again, and then back to San Diego again, and then walking somewhat past LA and, part of the way up the coast toward
Hawaii.
Toward San Francisco or San Jose. So it's a lot of walking that he did.
Now, half of that was walking, half was boat.
Yeah, but the boats weren't easy.
No, they weren't.
We would not, they were small, miserable. et cetera. And that doesn't necessarily count walking around town, as I recall that.
Right.
Yeah.
These are trips from
he would have walked
one mission station to
right.
another.
He would have walked a mile here, 5 miles there, over and over. You and I both know pastors who do give up, and unfortunately, we know pastors who preparing a sermon's hard, and they kind of stop. They plagiarize, or they get a sermon service. I had a pastor once who would, every 6 weeks, stand up and say, "I'm sorry, but I didn't have time to prepare my sermon properly this week." And then he would demonstrate that he had spoken the truth when he made that announcement. And it tore his church apart eventually, because he was a really good man. He was a kind man and had many virtues, but he wasn't able to discipline himself, at least in that regard. So we'll maybe wrap up this section with a question. So what would you say is the connection between being a tree man and a scholar? And by the way, you also edit a journal. That's work as well. What's the connection? Do you see? I'm proposing there's one. Do you agree? What's the connection?
Well, one is having a sense of responsibility and doing the best you can to live up to what the responsibility is. All these things are service for other people, and you can do them for yourself. You can do them as sort of a hireling mentality. What's the salary? What's the paycheck? That's what I'm here to do. But if you are distinguished in your work, then you're going to be doing it for bigger reasons than your paycheck. And early on, I had a very domineering father, and I was conditioned to do things for him, and they better be done well. Fairly late in adolescence, I got serious about serving God, faith in Jesus Christ, and received a call to devote my life to what I've ended up doing, which is studying Scripture and teaching Scripture. But I was bivocational, and the same sorts of scruples that a Christian should have in serving the Lord, I realized, well, this is part of work too. So I need to be an honest workman. Most logging that I did, it was all piecework. So by the log or by the board feet, and you scaled your own wood, and you counted your own stumps, and you counted your own logs. And especially on smaller jobs, they didn't have any way to check you. And I knew bosses, they figured 33% stealing on the part of the guys who did what I did, which was cut the wood.
So they would reduce their reports or whatever to be realistic. They had to say, well, he said he did 100.
They would pay you a third less than what they should have been paying you. So on those jobs, I was cut. I would always be honest in what I turned in.
So you were taking a 33% pay cut.
For the sake of all the guys out there who were cheating.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when layoffs came, those were the people that went. And I found out within about 2 years, I did this for 5 years, at the end of 2 years, I realized that the people in that region who were honest were very, very few. And all the logging contractors knew who the few honest ones were. So I was never out of work.
Yeah. So we would say, we always say that we say a couple things. When we work, we do it out of love for God and love for neighbor, and we also hope there's some joy in the labor. And the way I say it in this podcast is we try to change our corner of the world. How would you describe your efforts to change your corner of the world through your work? Maybe right now. Obviously, there's a degree to which it's obvious. Logging, you're making boards for furniture and houses and things, and taking dangerous trees down. How do you change your corner of the world today as a professor? You could say how you're changing. You could add how you're changing the world a little bit. Your corner of the world as a logger. How do you change your corner of the world? And do you take pleasure in that?
Well, I think, these things start locally. So certainly you want to think about, if you're married, you want to think about your marriage and your relationship with your kids. And hopefully you're a plus factor there. And if you're not a plus factor there, whatever you are beyond that, I think Jesus called that hypocrisy. So that's the first priority, because sometimes you can cannibalize, say, your marriage or your family relations to get professional gain. Or you can look good in the eyes of people outside your home, but people in your home curse your name. So you don't want that to happen. I think what we see as seminary professors is we see people often get fired up about what they're called to do. They get illumination on their path. Dan, you and I discussed close to 30 years ago how a certain percentage of people that come to seminary, which is supposed to be, for professional equipping, they're just there to find themselves.
Yes.
Or they're there for personal remedial reasons as much as anything else. And it's amazing how many people find themselves getting reconstructed or put back together. And the relation to what we do directly may be tangential or oblique.
Yes.
So it's not something we can take credit for. But we create a scenario where people find God in new ways, or they find resources to be the person that they want to be, but they have struggled largely unsuccessful to this point.
And they're willing, in this case of going to seminary, they're willing to say, I'll spend a year studying theology to get to the bottom of what God wants of me, which may be, to work in construction or, be an editor of a newspaper, whatever the case may be, an engineer, just a better engineer.
Yeah. So I would say that the main thing is just seeing people encouraged in the subject matter that we teach and the direction that it takes them. And then, as I get older, I actually do reflect on these things sometimes. A lot of times, and this is truer as more and more of our students are younger. 30 years ago, it was more people in their 30s. There are a lot of people now in their 20s, and a lot of them came from more compromised family settings than used to be the case.
Right.
And just generally, it seems people that are shakier in a lot of ways, and just the dignity of being taken seriously. They're paper marked carefully, being interacted with, being taken seriously as a man or woman who's seeking God at a serious level. And this isn't Sunday school. This isn't just pro forma professional training. There's something eternal at stake here, and you are significant in what God is doing in the world. And there's something that lifts us outside of ourselves when we combine in the task of seeking and finding and serving and worshiping together. And that's probably the best reason that God keeps me around for another week, day, month, is that I'm part of communities where people really are, I think, glorifying God, living better lives, and doing the will of God on earth. And Dan, you have these same opportunities. This week, I'm doing a podcast in England. And also our friend Michael Van Andel in South Africa, he's scheming on some things that will be taking place in Johannesburg, but really around the world. There are a lot of ways that the Word of God is going forth. And those of us who teach it have a wonderful privilege of encouraging people in their walk of discipleship and service to Christ.
Well, I'm going to pick up on two things you said and maybe label them or restate them. The first is that, these things occur in community and they're holistic. So, you're teaching somebody, Greek exegesis or maybe biblical ethics, and they want to meet with you, and they don't actually want to meet with you about Greek much, except maybe something that happened in Greek class. And they're reflecting on a broken relationship or maybe a marital challenge they have. And we enter into that. I mean, we change our corner of the world by simply being more than a professor and spending time with them on the life issue they're working on. So we agree on that. The other thing we agree on is that people, wring their hands and maybe even pull their hair about the decline of Christianity in Europe and North America. But as you and I both know, it's growing by enormous measures in South America and Africa and most of Asia, if not all of Asia. It's just an amazing season. I was reminded yesterday of the fact that an organization that we know about called Third Millennium, which we both helped out with a little bit, has produced a variety of shows, including one on the life of Jesus and who he is. And they kind of dropped off a bunch of videos in Mandarin and English in Mongolia, where it became the #1 TV show of the year a few years ago. Not the #1 educational show, the #1 show of the year. Now, Mongolia doesn't have a huge TV industry, so the competition's not as fierce, but it's fast. And Mongolia's not a Christian country. I think we agree on that. So let me ask you a slightly different question. Maybe it's up the same alley. How do you pray for your work? What do you pray for?
There are, I guess, kind of two kinds of prayers. One are doxological.
Right.
So just worshipful prayers, reflective prayers. Beyond that, I would just say ad hoc.
Okay.
What are the needs? Students know I have 3x5 cards that I take up on every student with some personal information. And in the course of the semester, I pray through those cards. And as the semester unfolds, I learn more about students. So often it's what the students are up against that I'm praying for. There are institutional needs. There are world church needs. There are personal needs that, my wife and I are facing various challenges. So it's whatever is on the front burner, back burner, in the microwave, and in both ovens. There's never a shortage of things that aren't being prayed for enough, but that can be prayed for some.
Yeah, I like that categorization, doxological and other, which is not a bad way to look at life. It sometimes is a challenge to heed the command to always be filled with thanks, to be prayerful always and thankful always. But it's a beautiful part of God's instruction to us. We have a rapid fire set of questions, but I want to ask you if you want to tell us anything else before we go to the rapid fire questions. Is there a word you want to say, a story you want to tell, anything you want to tell before we go to our rapid fire late interview stage?
The only other thing I guess I'll want to remind you of is Paul, because we talked about him. He was a tradesman.
Yes.
And there's debate in the literature. Of course, in all scholarly literature on the Bible, there's debate.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that you think somebody is denying it somewhere. But I'm going to say we can make a strong case that Paul was a skilled and competent leather maker, or tent maker, or something like that. And it's easy to forget and to trivialize the significance of Jesus not beginning his public ministry till he was 30, and Jesus being a tradesman.
Right.
And Jesus being from Galilee, and Jesus being a man among men. And his parables are not the parables of an academic, they're not the parables of an intellectual, they're a parable of somebody who lived among common people and had great respect for how God changes the world through changing common people. And he did not, he fraternized with the Pharisees who would listen, sort of the intellectual aristocracy, but he didn't cut them any slack, and he didn't vest his future in the elite professional class. and yeah. I think this is very important for us to remember wherever we are, that Jesus and his disciples were common people, tradespeople, and we should be careful, especially in a society that's become more and more elitist and that farms out more and more of certain kinds of work to other parts of the world. Or like in our own culture, we don't have the tradespeople, we don't have the trained manual labor people that we need. We're not sending our kids to school, to trade schools. We're sending them to universities where they learn often not to be of much use for anything practical. There's something against the drift of what Jesus called us to if we're not careful. And we want to remember who it is that we serve in his earthly manifestation.
Yeah, we could say Jesus didn't have footnotes. He wasn't in the quoting the expert business. He quoted the Bible. He didn't quote, the intelligentsia of his day, number one. Number two, his parables are often about things like planting a field or bringing harvest from a tree, very ordinary tasks. I've also thought many times about Jesus' hands and Paul's hands. If Paul worked with leather, he had to have strong, gnarly, kind of beat up hands. And Jesus, I know you know this. You didn't say he's a carpenter. You said he was a tradesman. because, of course, the Greek is tekton, which can mean carpenter, but also it means somebody who works with materials. And he probably was skilled with stone.
Could be stonemason.
And certainly also possibly metal. But we could say construction worker, manual labor, skilled labor, artisan, all those words work. But I have a feeling if you shook Jesus' hand, you would know you shook a hand. I mean, you don't work with wood and stone for 20 plus years without getting ridiculously strong, calloused, rough, beat up hands. Okay, good. Let's go to the rapid fire questions, and you know what these are. What do you do to play or relax? What do you do for fun?
I do something different than what I was doing.
Yeah.
I cut wood.
Yes.
At home. I heat with wood, and that's recreational, a change of scene.
Yep.
And my wife and I like to go out to eat.
Okay.
That's fun.
You also hike in the woods. You enjoy that, especially with your dog or dogs.
That's a blast, and I do it 5 times a day. Get the dogs out and see what animal they're going to chase and possibly kill next.
Yeah, and that's when it's 95 degrees or 9 degrees.
It doesn't matter how cold or hot. They're always happy to get outside and explore.
And sometimes the adults are happy also.
Yes, yes. As I tell them, if you want to control, you have to patrol. So one of them's a German Shepherd, so he's a great patrol dog.
That's good. All right. What book do you give or like to give the friends to read right now?
We're back to ad hoc.
Yeah.
I don't have a book of the month or...
what's the last book you gave to a friend to read you can think of?
Gave to a friend?
Yeah. So you got to read this. It's so important to me, I'm going to just give it to you.
Probably the last books I bought for people, I mentioned doxological praying, and I buy the 3 volumes of the Divine Hours,
okay,
which are a 3-time-a-day devotional guide,
right?
Summer, fall, winter, and spring, and I've given them to a number of people that I've done the weddings for.
Okay,
to encourage them in their wedding to have a time at least one of the 3 times during the day. Take that time and make sure you open your hearts up to God.
That's great.
The other book I recommend again and again to students is The Chosen.
Yes.
By Chaim Potek. It's just such a great book about another religious tradition and has so much to say about human meaning and human relations and erudition and learning.
And baseball.
Baseball's got a wonderful little cameo in there.
Right.
It's just a very renewing and nurturing book if you are involved in theological study.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also a book about family, deeply a book about family.
And also, how do you honor tradition when at the same time you have to break with the tradition?
Right.
Those tensions that are there. There are some unbelievable scenes in that book that if you've ever tried to learn Hebrew or Greek, beat your head against the wall of these bodies of knowledge, and you read that book, you just really feel like I've been there, and this is manna for my soul.
Yeah, absolutely. Putting practical considerations aside, what would you do? What job would you take for a year?
My wife would laugh at this, but she knows it's true. I'd drive truck for a year.
Oh yeah.
I'd go back tree trimming for a year.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind being a farmer.
Yeah.
Mow hay in the summer and do whatever they do in the fall with equipment and spring planting. And so I'm pretty open to any challenging outdoor work.
Right.
Or work with machinery.
Yeah.
I like to operate machinery.
If you were to exhort, train, teach, mentor a talented newcomer, and I'll let you go either way, but not both, tree work or academic work, what would you say to that person?
Kind of goes back to your negative example of the pastor who wasn't prepared. I would say be prepared when you show up for work.
Yeah, show up prepared. That's
because even when I was a student, there were 2 kinds of professors. There were professors who really were ready for that hour, and then there were professors that I felt like were cheating me out of my tuition because it was just a formality for them. They had their notebook, they had what they were going to go through, and they hadn't given that time or that group of people any special thought. And
it was the same lecture they'd given 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Or maybe 20 years ago. Yeah, that always, I would occasionally, if I had a professor give what I consider a lifeless lecture, I would occasionally try to stroll up and ask them a question and look at the pages and see if they were yellowing. And I would also sometimes ask, what's the most recent book they cited? And if the most recent citation was from 20 years earlier, I thought, okay, now I understand why this lecture is lifeless.
Right.
Yeah. What do people get wrong about your work? What would they be surprised to learn?
You know, it depends on the people. I think people think teaching is easy, but anybody who does teaching and aspires to do it well knows that it's not easy. You know, we happen to be Christians, and broadly speaking, we might well be called evangelicals, and I'm perceiving a more and more pitched antagonism against evangelicals because it's so pointless and it's just hating. That's what it is. There's a recent article in People magazine about a well-known evangelical national leader who's now a woman, and he's pastoring as a woman. And that's his whole theme, is the hatefulness of evangelicalism. And basically people are just doing it, for money, and they're deluded, and so kind of the wickedness of it, but that's not really what we're doing. We're mediating God's grace and seeing lives changed. Mm-hmm. So there's a much more beneficial purpose, and then we could get into history of Christianity and hospitals and caring for people
and universities
and the benefits of Christianity to the larger world. But that aside, I think that the basic misunderstandings are that it's easy or that it's either pointless or even detrimental to people, what you do.
Yeah, that's become a theme lately. Last question. Who should I interview next, in your opinion? And if I don't know him or her, would you connect us?
Well, I'd love to see you interview Neil Henry in Cape Town,
okay,
South Africa, or either Dana Harris at Trinity or Sydney Park at Beeson. Two women who teach the New Testament, who've gone through a lot to be where they are. Neil Henry is a Christian leader in Cape Town who ministers in a very large ghetto there and grew up in that disadvantaged demographic under apartheid, and is a tremendously effective leader there in what's called the Christian Leadership Program, as well as a pastor.
Yeah.
So very colorful background and very nice accent. And you can interview him in English or Afrikaans and maybe another language or two as well. And he'll have a lot to say on a lot of different things.
Yeah. Theoretically, I could interview in Afrikaans. I would have to learn Afrikaans first.
Well, that's up to you.
Bob, it's a pleasure to have you and hear your views and have your contribution to this little hour, but also really to the wider world. And I'm deeply appreciative for your work and your insights. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and rate us on your preferred podcast platform. You can visit our website at faithandworkstl.org. There you can subscribe to our podcast, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about Faith and Work cohorts, leave us a message, and more. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Faith and Work STL, and find the video version of this show on our YouTube channel. All these links are available in the podcast show notes and on our website. Thanks for listening.